Brandi Keller. As you can see, we have our lecture series lined up for the second quarter. Registration is open there. So by all means, in 2 weeks, we'll be back with summer bulbs. So without any further ado, I want to first welcome any new attendees. I'm glad you're with us. And if you've been here before, we are glad to have you back. So our speaker today, as I mentioned, is Brandi Keller. She is the program coordinator for the Harris County Master Gardener program. And Brandi, it is all yours. Take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, well, welcome everyone. This finishes up our first quarter, so thank you for attending up until January through March. Now, when we are covering these talks, a lot of times we say they're 30 minutes. Sometimes, they run over, it's 45, 60. And it's still really hard to get really in depth. So this talk is really going to narrow it down to just focus on basil. And of course, basil is super awesome because it's just such a bright, clean taste, flavor, really makes things seem really fresh. And because it is an herb, herbs tend to really tap into our memories. And for me, my mom got me into plants in general because of herbs. And basil was one of them, lemongrass and bay leaves. So I know that even though there's a lot of uses for herbs, a lot of that taps into, our own history. What we'll cover today, so as you see, we're really going to be able to kind of tap into cover all the bases here, hopefully, through varieties all the way up to using. So what is basil? Well, first, it's a warm season, sun-loving herb. And an herb is any plant that's really valued for its aroma, the flavor, or some kind of medicinal quality. And herbs refer to herbaceous plants, and they usually come from temperate climates, whereas spices, they're really made from seeds, roots, barks, and they come from warm tropical climates. So even though sometimes people interchange those two words, they are very different. So basil is a herb, and it did originate from India, but it's really an important plant all around the world, especially with Italian and Thai recipes. It is also related to mint, Lamiaceae. There are some similarities, especially when you get into some other varieties of basil that we'll see that, to me, it definitely looks more like mint than basil. And then, of course, it's a really important flavoring to be used in recipes, sauces. Obviously, the one at the top of our list is usually pesto, but it can really be used in a lot of different ways. So there are so many varieties of basil. So you have big and small leaves, tall and short, smooth leaves and crinkled leaves, or even the deep green or pale green. And then, of course, the purples really pop out on this particular page. So basil can really be used as a food or an ornamental, which really makes it a really great landscape plant, because then you're getting something ornamental out of it, but it also has a functional purpose too. And it's really easy to grow in pots. So you can use it in pots, in a garden, as edging, or even a specimen plant. I mean, you can just see those purples, just imagine like the contrast next to a green, really bright green plants, or even some kind of annuals that have like a white or pink flower that really contrasts really, really nicely. And then, of course, some basils are specifically just grown for their flowers. Now, I tried to get this, how these pictures pop up off of here, and we're just stuck with it for this presentation. So they all pop up like that. So with so many basils, I'm just going to try to break this down easily so we aren't concentrating so much like on the technical name, but you get an idea of how they're all related. So I already mentioned that it's in the family of mint, Lamiaceae, and then right below that would be genus, which is Ocimum. And within that genus, there are 35 species that are annual and perennial. And so here you can see it's the most common one is Ocimum basilicum. It is by far the most common in most of the basils that we purchase and use fall into this species. And I just lost my train of thought, so sorry. And then, of course, the basilicum, that is Greek, and it means kingly. So we can say that basil is the king of all herbs. It's literally in its name. But then going down below with the cultivars, there are so many different names that you'll see, and those are the cultivar name. And basically that just means it's a cultivated variety. They are not naturally occurring. We have selected them for certain characteristics. And then basil is so easy to cross-pollinate that, they've done that so many times, and then they come up with the best varieties. But as you notice on here, the cultivar is in single quotes and it is capitalized. And there's about 100 cultivars. I don't have to tell you, we're not covering all 100 today. Okay, so I added categories in because basil is such a large group that categories is really kind of like an unofficial grouping that when you're Googling, you go to the greenhouse, you will see these general umbrellas, and it's just a way for us to understand these categories a little better, and it kind of groups the flavors together a bit more. So with the sweet basils, they are generally, as the term says, sweet and a little spicy, peppery. Purple is a little less sweet. And with that purple leaf, that can actually be used too for, imparting that color into a liquid. And then Thai has a very licorice flavor, so anise flavor. And then citrus, there are lemon and lime, and usually those are really intense citrus flavors and scents. And then dwarf can be a handful of different basils, but because those leaves are really small, they tend to be a little bit more intense than the sweet basils. And then ornamental is another category. Any of the previous basils can fall into that. It's really, personal preference, what you think is ornamental. There are other categories, but these are really the general ones that I've seen. So we're going to start off with sweet basils. Since it is the bigger group, I have 2 slides on this. We're not going to go through all the varieties, but Genovese has to be the most popular. A lot of times, sweet basil and Genovese, those 2 names are interchanged. You will see Genovese in garden centers, but sometimes you'll just see sweet when it is Genovese. Some people just interchange them, but they are very different. Not very different, but they're different. Genovese is a lot stronger, and the leaves are a bit more flat. So if you are just seeing sweet when you're out and about, you may be seeing this one. The height is, so 18 to 24 inches is really going to cover a lot of the basils we talk about. If they're much shorter or taller, I put that on there. So this is also really probably the most common one for culinary use, either using raw or putting in with cooking. And then you can see the mammoth on the right is so different. So of course, the name is mammoth because it is a larger plant. This one is going to get about 20 feet tall, so about the same height, but those leaves are like 6 to 8 inches wide. They are really big leaves compared to all the other basils. So you know, this is immediately just showing a lot of diversity. And with mammoth, it can take a little bit less shade too, but we'll talk about requirements here in a little bit. Pesto perpetuo, this is one of my favorites, and I don't see it everywhere, although I do see it sometimes. For me, it's just a really easy basil. I don't tend to use this one for pesto, but it is absolutely usable for pesto. A lot of people do. This is more of a columnar basil, so it's going to grow taller and less wide. And then you can see the lemon lime color with the variegation with that really nice white along the edges. So this one, obviously, you can tell makes a really great ornamental. But it is big. I would say it's probably about 36 inches tall. So it grows like a small shrub for sure. So this would be good in gardens or containers, but like we were talking about, maybe even for edging. Greek basils also can be ornamental, and you can see that they have smaller leaves. Regular Greek, they're going to be a little bit shorter than this one shown. They're about 8 inches tall with like a dome shape. But the one shown here is the Greek columnar. And there is a dwarf version of this too, but this one is a little bit taller. I think it can grow about 3 feet tall. So it's going to grow a lot taller, just like the pesto. But this one has a little bit of like a cinnamon flavor, so that's how it varies. So it might go really well with, you know, sauces and meats. And neither one of these flower. Now, does it mean you'll never see a flower? Maybe not, but you generally won't, which is the beauty of it. If you're one who's always battling that flower, then the appreciation really comes in. Purple basils, obviously totally ornamental, just based on what you can see with that beautiful coloring. Again, similar in height, less sweet than the common, but a little bit more clove taste. And when you use these leaves, they do flavor vinegars and oils a little bit pink. So that purple ruffles, they have pink flowers, and that's probably the most ornamental one with how ruffly those edges are. So that would really contrast nicely with, you know, pink, white, even yellow flowers. And then the red Reuben is actually an improved variety off of a dark opal. So it is a little bit more disease resistant. So that's not a bad thing. And it has a little bit more of a clove flavor. Thai basils, so you can see by the name, the Basilicum variation, let me see if I can get this right, Thyriciflorum. So it has VAR. That VAR means variety. So there can be 2 plants that are within the same species, but the genetics are different. And so that VAR defines that. And in this case, the leaves are really different and the scent is different with that licorice flavor. Thai, you will see Thai basil if you eat pho. And it is the one when I'm out eating that, I always confuse it for mint because it really does have more of a mint look compared to other basils. And with the leaves too, you can see how they're pointing up, so they're more narrow. And so they're a little bit more firm, so they hold up in cooking a little bit better. This is a perennial compared to the previous ones, which are annual herbs. These are perennial, so it does go dormant if it goes below 50 degrees. Although none of the basils like anything much below 50. This has a really strong anise flavor, and you can't really see the stems, but they're a dark purple, so just really beautiful even for some stem cuttings when those flowers bloom. The one on the right is, that's just an improved Thai basil. And so it has some similarities, but that flower is not similar to the one on the left because it grows really wide. Those flowers can get about 5 inches wide, and this entire plant can get 2 to 3 feet tall also. So other basils, there's so, like I said, there's so many other like informal categories that I've just put them all underneath other basils. So you have the citrus, which you can see is a different species on here. It has a very intense citrus flavor. Some of these will grow 15 inches. Others, like Mrs. Burns lemon, can grow up to 30 inches. And these would be really good, you know, with salad, soups, fish because of that lemon flavor, or even something unique, making like a lemon basil pesto out of it. Let's see. Oh, the one on the left is cinnamon. Sorry, I had to quiet that. The cinnamon is really different because it is the only one that has that really cinnamon flavor. The leaves are a bit serrated on the edges, and you can see that that stem is purple, just not as dark as the Thai. And these grow a little bit taller, up to 30 inches. And these also would be really good with, you know, like sweet recipes too. The holy basil I went ahead and included because if I have seen it around some garden centers. Of course, it's a different species. It's much more mild. It has those really jaggedy leaves. It kind of reminds me of like a really small pin oak or something. But the leaves are a little bit fuzzy, and it has pink or white flowers. This is more sweet than some of the others. And it does reseed, but because you can kind of tell by the leaves, it's a bit bitter. So it's not used as much for cooking, and it does have another name. The name is Tulsi, which is a sacred plant in Hinduism. So you might see either of those names interchanged. And then spicy globe, like in general, there's like a globe or dwarf category with, you know, a handful of basils with this shape. This spicy globe is really attractive because you don't really have to do much pruning to it. You know, it's really uniform, really dense. Those leaves are compact. It's very similar in taste to the sweet basils. But as mentioned earlier, they can be more intense, so you can use less of them. And then because the leaves are smaller, you don't have to, sometimes you don't have to even chop them up. And then the other benefit with this one is the leaves the stems are really soft, so you can actually use that in your cooking also. All right, and our last one is African blue basil. So this is a hybrid between a camphor basil and a dark opal. And you can see by the, I think I tried this name before, Key Lyman Scaricum. I don't know, everybody do that together. See if you could figure that out. I had it earlier, but it's one of those that you can't get it every time. So this one's a perennial. It is very tall, about 36 inches, tall and wide. It's sterile, so you can only propagate it by cuttings. And you can see with the left picture that those purple flower stems are longer than any other basil. They're about 18 inches. So they can be pink with a little bit of purple. The flowers are edible. You can use those in salads. But because of the mix, that this comes from with that camphor part. Oh, you know, I think you'd have to like cook it, but it's probably not used much in cooking. It is really used with ornamentals. Our master gardeners really love to use this in vegetable gardens and grow it for vegetables, but you have to accommodate for space because it will grow. I won't even say a small shrub. It can grow like a medium shrub. So this one's definitely more ornamental. All right, getting into growing, planting and growing, because they said it was a warm season annual, it definitely takes full or part sun. Rich, well-drained soils, so it does like to be moist, but definitely not overwater. Kind of skipped over something. I'm going to go back and say like where these can be planted. So I talked about some, but like in gardens, containers, or even indoors. And I'm going to touch on indoors in a minute too. So it can actually be grown in the windowsill, like in the cooler seasons, depending on where you are. And then when to plant after any frost date. Basil is very, very cold intolerant. Here in Houston, you can definitely plant it now. If you're out of the area, then you want to wait until after your last frost date. It likes daytime temps of 70 degrees. And then once it hits the 80s, it really takes off. But going back to the soil, poor soil will it will slow the growth, and then that affects the flavor of the leaves. So you do want some kind of rich soil. If you're dealing with pots or indoors, that's easy because the prepared potting medium is great. If you're planting in ground, you just want to be aware of that. And then with watering, it does not like to have its leaves constantly wet. So I tend to water close to the soil surface so if you're using a hose. Otherwise, a drip or soaker hose would work really well too. And fertilizing. So do not over fertilize because you can get a whole lot of growth and then that can also affect the taste. So you want to be able to fertilize a little bit if that soil needs it, but and a lot of times it doesn't need a whole lot. So starting seeds indoors. You always want to go by the envelope, but most basil seeds are really small, so they're going to be planted about 1/4 inch deep. It does take about 5 to 10 days to have them come up, and you want that media temperature right around 70 degrees. You don't want to just try to grow seeds just with some light. It needs that warmth. So you may even look into some kind of inexpensive seed starting mat. So you place your seeds on top of that and it just provides a really consistent warmth needed to germinate those seeds. And then in about 3 to 4 weeks, they will be big enough to transplant. And this says 2 sets of true, so you want 2 sets of true leaves at least, and then you can pot up. But I have an example of the true leaves and the contrast to that. We'll get to that in a second. So you can do seeds, you can do cuttings. Basil is extremely easy to do from cuttings. So what does that mean? It means that you just take a piece of the plant, add some moisture, and then roots will grow. But you do need to pick a part of the plant that is best for rooting, and that is you don't want like really thick heavy stems. You want something that's maybe still a little bit more bendable, and then I'll show you in the next slide where we made these cuts. And then you want 4 to 6 inch piece. If it's too long, it just won't do well. You want that stem to be able to carry that water. And if it's too long, it's not going to make it all the way to the top. So in this case, more is not better. And then I did want to mention there was some research done with AgriLife Extension, and it showed that seeds from seed packets, the flavors really varied because the genetics of those seeds can vary within that same packet. Whereas if you do cuttings, you get all the same, you know exactly what you're getting. So, you know, there's benefits for each of those. And then, of course, cuttings are very successful. In their study, 100% of them rooted from cuttings compared to 90% from seeds. We're not trying to dissuade you from planting seeds. It's just give you an idea of how easy it is to propagate with cuttings. And let me see if the next slide. So these were already cut, and where the arrows are, there were 2 sets of leaves coming out. So those were just pruned off. And then when you have a cup with some potting mix, it could be potting soil, like vermiculite, something like that. You can put a pencil down in through to establish the hole and then stick that down. The important part is you see that bottom arrow. That is where some leaves were growing, and those are growth nodes. And it's not the only place where roots will come from, but it is going to be the primary place where the roots come from. So you want to be sure you have that in your cutting, in your piece, but then that's also the part that you want below that potting mix, because that's where the roots are going to come from. And so with cuttings, you are good to go to transplant in 2 to 3 weeks. When you're able to pull a little bit and the plant is coming up, then you have enough root, and that's how you know that it's time to transplant. Or this is the easiest way, just go to the store and buy some basil. We've all done it. It's definitely the easiest. But by looking at this picture, it shows one small disadvantage, and that is they plant so many seeds in there that you have, it's easy to have more than a dozen plants in one really small pot. So even though it just may kill you to do this, you want to thin those down to 1 or 2 plants. You can pinch, they're soft enough, you can pinch them with your fingernail or your finger, or just cut them off. And again, the research earlier showed that when you grow just 1 basil cutting in a pot, that it has the strongest roots. So if it has strong roots, then it's going to be able to support a lot of healthy growth on top. Again, you can plant these now in this area. And when you plant, they're generally, if they're in the ground, about 12 inches apart. For larger varieties, you'd like that a little bit further apart. Growing indoors. So we can't talk about basil without, you know, mentioning all the people that may not have like a big garden, or they just want the convenience of having it at their window. And really, if you have herbs at your window, you're more likely to use them. So you still need 6 hours of sunlight. A south-facing window would be perfect. They like it warm and watered, so you know, no cold breezes coming in. And you can move those same plants outside in the summer. They will probably do better, and then move them back in. If you do not have adequate windows, just a cheap LED grow light will work. The only thing with that is that it needs more of the light. So instead of 6 hours of sunlight, it'll need 12 hours of grow light. And then also the other thing, probably one of the biggest mistakes people make, is they put the light way too high. So this really needs to be about 2 to 4 inches from the plant. Otherwise, you know, they'll get real leggy. Microgreens, I think this is the last little version of how to grow them. I do have I have a link that we can provide you on growing microgreens. Microgreens really can be grown with a lot of different vegetables or herbs like broccoli, spinach, kale, radish, just tons, mustard greens. With basil, though, it's actually probably one of the longest ones to to get big enough to harvest. So you have to have a little bit more patience. So the idea is when these little plants come up, they are eaten in that young state. So they are much more nutrient dense. And then the other thing is they can be grown in a very small space. Again, even on a window. They have a similar taste to their adult, just a little bit sweeter. So yeah, 2 weeks. I probably went, when I grew mine, it was probably a little more than 2 weeks. So again, it depends on the lighting too. Now I talked about the first set of true leaves, and this is a good close-up of that. The arrows are pointing to the true leaves. The two other ones are cotyledons. Those are what you would assume are not true leaves. Those are the first two leaves that pop up. So those don't count. You want to have at least one set of true leaves. And for microgreens, I like a couple. But microgreens can probably be a whole nother topic. But again, hopefully they have that link to provide you for that. And a quick note on the seeds, and this is especially when you're doing microgreens or growing seeds. Basil and chia seeds both share a similar quality in that they become gelatinous when they are wet. And so basically they swell up. It's like proteins and polysaccharides that swell up around the seed, and it's a defense mechanism. So it helps protect that seed. So like in floods or other harsher environmental conditions, outdoors, it protects that seed. To the left are the basil flowers gone to seed. The middle picture shows on the left are the black seeds. Those are basil. The ones to the right are chia, and you will see they are not as black because it's more a mixture of gray, white, darker ones. And then to the right are the basil seeds after they have absorbed water. So with chia, it takes about 30 minutes to absorb, but with basil, it's almost immediate. So when you're planting these seeds, and I have to admit that I noticed it right off the bat the first time I did it, you will see it and you almost think, oh my gosh, did like mold grow like totally immediately? Nope, it's all safe. It's just those seeds. But it's really incredible because that gel, even though it looks wet, it protects the seed from getting too wet, and it has a way to release just a small amount of moisture to keep them alive. So it's really incredible. So this would be the fun fact of this presentation. And touch on disease and pests. The most common is downy mildew, which is unfortunately spread by wind, so it's really hard. There's really no chemical that you can use to treat it after you already see the symptoms. So if you do have symptoms, you'll just have to throw it out. But don't throw out any plant that you see that the leaves are just yellowing, because the first symptoms of downy mildew is chlorosis, and that can mimic a nutritional deficiency. When these plants get low in nitrogen, they can turn yellow. The difference is if you can see the upper left picture at all, you kind of see where the yellow stays between the veins, and it's because it can't travel over those veins or, up over, so the veins are still green. So that would be one clue if it's a nutritional deficiency or downy mildew. And then if it's further along, underneath on the bottom side, you can see like the fuzzy and gray mildew underneath. It starts with the older leaves and then works up. The ones that are susceptible to this are really Genovese, Italian large leaf. There's a red one, red Reuben. And then, of course, sunburn and insects. Harvesting and storing. So you want the plant at least 10 to 12 inches tall, and to harvest in the morning because that's when the oils are the most concentrated. Once the heat of the day comes, then that plant is competing with the sun, and then the oils kind of minimize. So that's why they always recommend harvesting in the morning. And you may not need basil like at any particular moment, but harvest it anyway, because by harvesting it, you actually create a bushier and you create more leaves too. And because it's not cold tolerant, you definitely want to harvest it before a frost. So here's an example of what harvesting, pinching, pruning can do. On the left, they're kind of small, but I gave some ideas where those red lines are of where you would prune it. You want at least one set of true leaves and cut right above it. And then from that set of true leaves, 2 more branches will come out. So the plant on the right, it looks like it has been pruned to make it really nice and full. If you're like me, most of our basil looks like on the left, but our basil can look so much better. We need to do better, right? Storing. So just storing it temporarily in the house in a glass of water, room temperature. The refrigerator is too cold. It does not like temperatures below 50, which is our refrigerator. So keep it room temperature. You can also store it in plastic. And then don't forget about the flowers. They can either be used for arrangements or in salads. So you can collect those. Preserving. There's really 2 to 3 good ways of preserving. I didn't include pesto on here, but I included the picture, and that's probably the most common way to preserve. But drying leaves, what happens is so as basil dries, the volatile oils in those leaves dry, and so you won't get the same taste from basil that's been frozen compared to dried. I personally never dry. I'll throw out basil before I dry it. It sounds terrible. But freezing really preserves sometimes the color and those oils and the intensity and that true flavor. And you can do that a variety of ways in water or oil. Nutritional benefits. Really, basil has a ton of vitamin A and calcium. You would just have to eat like 2 cups of it. So even though we wouldn't want to eat that much basil, it does show that, you know, on a daily intake, it can really add to our diet. All right, here's my one joke for the day. What do you call basil, pine nuts, and olive oil with a bad attitude? Give you a few seconds. Can you guess? Pessimistic. That's my cheesy joke for today. You're welcome. And of course, that was a great segue into pesto. I think there should be a recipe provided by dinner tonight that we can add in right now. It's all generally the same. I don't know if you guys are.
Brandi.
What's that?
I just posted it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, should we take a couple questions? We're getting on right now.
Yeah, I have a couple if you want to take a break.
Okay.
All right. The first one, Karen is asking about any basil varieties which should not be consumed.
Well, I kind of went over those. You can go back and review this, but like the holy basil is edible. It's just not as palatable as other ones, and I think you want to cook it. The African blue basil is edible, but again, because it has that camphor in it, generally they're not inedible. It's more when you get into different species or the hybrids that have been bred from different species that might just not be as tasty. So on the list that I gave you, that holy basil, and it's still definitely used in cooking, it just might not be what we are thinking if you were to taste it. So.
Okay, another question. Is boxwood basil the same as Greek columnar?
That is a good question. I don't think it is. I think it's a different basil. The columnar would grow very tall, where the boxwood, that would probably be considered a bush, and so it's going to grow lower.
Okay. Sarah's asking, what type of fertilizer should you suggest for a garden bed or a pot?
Well, if you're using some fresh potting soil from the store, I generally don't use fertilizer. If you want to use anything, you can use like a slow release. You just don't want anything that's going to give it like a ton, because it doesn't require it. But also too much of especially nitrogen can throw things off. If you have an in-ground garden and you're just not sure, it's always good to do a soil test just to see how that soil is. But again, in the ground, if you're going blind, I would just probably do some slow release. You just don't want to inundate it with a lot of fertilizer. And I generally don't use a whole lot anyway, but yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's the answer.
You want to continue, or you got one more?
Yeah, one more.
Okay. A person is having problems with their basil stems turning black. It starts at the bottom and moves up. Any idea?
Okay, so my question would be, is do the leaves look healthy at the top? And I'll give you a minute to see if that person answers that. Because a common question about basil is like, your basil on top looks fine, but then there's this darkening from the soil going up and they're concerned. And if I hear that the top is all healthy, then what that tells me is that that may be an older basil plant, and as basil ages, it gets woody. So it's actually just getting woody from the base up. That's kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, there's no response back. So
okay, but there are some other issues. I can't think of the name right now because of an F. Anyway, there are some other issues, but the way it was described from the base going up, and it depends if it's black or if it's just dark, you can feel it. It just may be that it's turning woody. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and then we'll take a couple more at the end. So of course, pesto, that's the no-brainer one. And then classic uses. So when I went to Yellowstone and saw the falls that Ansel Adams, the picture took, you're always trying to find a different view. It's like, no, everybody takes that picture. I want a different view. And then you realize, well, he took that picture there for a reason. It is because it is the best view. So we can do all the similar things with pesto, but it doesn't mean that those aren't still the tried and true wonderful ways to enjoy pesto. Even like a caprese salad. So don't think that you have to try to reinvent anything. The classics are the classics for a reason. They work. They're wonderful. Sweet treats. This is a lemon basil pie that I found. I do have some, I have a list of more resources that I can email you. I'll do that, let's see, maybe next Friday. I would just ask that you fill out that survey. The more I get, then I definitely like that, because we like to get our feedback, and that's a little thank you for doing that survey. But I have a few recipes, but this one is definitely a little bit of a different take. We don't think about basil in sweets, so I wanted to throw some unusual things in here. In drinks, so with tea, you can just steep the tea for 5 minutes in hot water, then strain. Lemonade or basil's definitely good in some adult beverages. And then another recipe I have for you is this basil and watermelon infused water. And then everyday uses with vinegars, oils, or even butters. Butters is one of them that, I don't know if you're like me, I say I'm going to do it every year and then I don't. So one of these days I'm going to make my herb butters. And then just, I think this is finishing up the lemon basil shrimp. This is from one of our AgriLife websites. I can add this too when I email out those links. And this is part of our My Plate and Eating Healthier. So we're just going to finish up the summary. Most basils are sweet basil, the basilicum. They're heat loving. You can grow them indoors or outdoors. You want to monitor, keep watered but not too wet, and don't let the leaves get wet. Pinch to encourage growth, and then harvest so you can freeze dry or make into pesto, and then use that later on in your recipes. Here are some resources and links. Some of these were included earlier, but you can review these later. And then my next talk is actually May 6th about the benefits of bats and how they benefit us as people, us as gardeners, and then even with some of our crops too. So do you want to go back and I can answer any other questions?
Yes, we do have a couple. I'll go through. I'll give Shannon a break on asking. One was they're trying to grow their basil from seed, and they're using the 8 carton. But when they put it in a larger pot, it just dies. They want to know what they might be doing wrong.
Well, I would wonder, number one, how big is it how big is the actual plant when they transplant it? With the seeds, to transplant, you want something that's going to, be big enough and sturdy enough. So I think going back, we were talking about from seeds. Let me go back. It was like 10 inches tall. It's like I have so much in my. So 3 to 4 weeks. So yeah, just depending on how long it's been in there. We don't know what those roots look like, if it was overwatered or if you had that heat coming up. So there's just a lot of different questions, what that actual seedling looks like, if it was leggy, if it didn't grow good roots, if you're trying to transplant it too soon. Yeah, I'm not really sure. If you have any more information, we can try to figure it out.
The next one is, it was posted. Someone told me once that basil, once it goes to bloom, the flavor of the plant isn't as good, and it's basically done. That obviously isn't true, I guess, from the presentation that you, the information that you just gave.
Yeah, and you know what? I think I accidentally skipped over that small piece of information, and that's part of the pinching process. That you're not only trying to encourage it to leaf out, but you also want to prolong the bloom. And once it blooms, you think about any flower, once it blooms, it's telling that plant, okay, this is as good as it's going to get, and our life is over after this. And that's kind of like with basil. So once it blooms, it sends signals to the entire plant that, you know, hey, my mission is over. Those oils that are in the leaves start diminishing, they turn bitter, and then eventually, you know, the leaves start yellowing and dying. So that is absolutely true. There are some basils that you want to go to seed just to get the seeds from, or like the African blue basil, you want to incorporate that in for pollinators. And any of the basils can be grown for pollinators too. But if you want to actually use the leaves, and I'm sorry I skipped over that, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, you want to prolong that bloom as much as possible. And that major way is pruning. And actually, one of the best ways to prune is to take any kind of new leaf, prune it down just above the first set of leaves on every single branch, and it'll be really bushy. But that also helps prolong blooming too.
Okay, and you know, Shannon mentioned about the one with the stems turning black.
Mm-hmm.
The reply was leaves look okay, but they pretty much stop growing. So I'm thinking maybe it is just a little bit too wet if they're turning black, or there could be pigment in that stem, because there are some dark stem basils out there, correct?
Yeah, yeah. More like the Thai, not a lot of the sweet ones. But yeah, it could be overwatering. Yeah, it just depends if it's real firm. Just look at it real well, or you can always send me a picture. Here's my email, Brandi.Keller. Sometimes with that, it's easier to see.
Okay, and then I know on some of the varieties, the question is, can you eat the flowers?
Yeah, most of the varieties you can. You know, they're really good for just popping into salads. Even that, oh gosh, my brain's fried. What is it, the blue, African blue basil. Even though the leaves aren't eaten much on that, those flowers are really sweet. So most of the flowers you can pick off and use. It's just whether people want to do that.
And the last question we've got is from Joe, and you know, from the image, all the the pest and disease symptoms, they can look really similar.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any tips or tricks that you have for identifying those?
I have a link. I don't know. I don't think I gave it to you to post. But I can send, I do have a link for different diseases. North Carolina, actually, Extension has a really nice one. I'm going back to this. Oh, the Cornell. Cornell has, they may have had some different ones on here. With Extension, they've really focused, with our AgriLife Extension, they focused on the downy mildew. So some of the other state extensions, I found better information on different ones. Like there's a Fusarium wilt. A lot of times it can just be overwatering or underwatering, or something caused by, overwatering the leaves. But I think I do have a link, and I'll send that out when I send out all the links so that way you can see some more pictures.
Okay, well, great. And the last one is about the Texas Superstar, the balsamic blooms. We have trialed that. I've grown it, performs well. You can eat the flowers. I know they've had some issues with the original company that introduced it. They pulled it from the market, but I think they found another producer. So yes, it is a great plant, performs well. There might be some issues finding it, but if you can find it, by all means, put it in the garden.
Yeah, I actually had that one in the presentation, and I decided to take it out just because it seemed like a tease, right? I mean, if you can't figure out where to buy it. But yeah, those blooms are really, really nice and big. And I'll also mention, just with availability, if you go to some of these big box stores, you're going to have some of like the sweet basils. When you go to some of the other family-owned garden centers, they have a wider variety. Of course, if you get seeds, you get the widest variety. But some of these garden centers, I know I found the holy basil, I found Greek, and I probably at a couple of them there were at least 6 or 7 varieties. So that's a little bit better when you want to get beyond the sweet basil.
All righty. Well, thank you, Brandi, very much. I just want to remind everyone, you will be receiving a survey link, and in that link, you will also receive a link to our YouTube channel to watch this presentation again if you need to go back. So keep your eyes open. If all goes well, it will come out later today. If not, it'll be first thing tomorrow. So with that, we want to thank you, Brandi. Again, thank you for your time and all that great information. And we will see you 2 weeks back here for the Homegrown Lecture Series. Thanks and have a great day.
Bye.